All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Ruby AI podcast. I'm one of your hosts today, Valentino Stoll, and joined by Joe. Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm the other host. I'm really excited today because I don't have to be the one to say a bunch of provocative or controversial things, because we are joined by Thomas Witt, who, in addition to being a builder and a Ruby and AI enthusiast, says plenty of controversial things for the three of us. So, Thomas, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be on.
Thomas, I kind of want to dig right in. You've got a startup that you're going to tell us all about, and you're a businessman and an engineer, which I respect because I like to think of myself as that as well. You said something that I thought was interesting recently, where you talked about it's a pre-seed investment firm, right? What's the name of it?
Yeah, Expedite Ventures.
Expedite Ventures.
Collective of CTOs.
Okay. And you said that, and I want to get this right here. You said that code stripped, many AI startups are actually naked, implying or outright saying that, hey, a lot of startups that say they are AI, I'm using air quotes here, are really just wrappers around a Codex or a Claude Sonnet API. And I'd love it if you could tell us a little more about that.
Yeah. So basically, we started Expedite Ventures like around 2020, and we've been to many phases. So we had obviously also a Web3 phase where we got a lot of Bitcoin and Ethereum pitches. And now we're basically 2 years ago or 3 years ago now, we got a lot of AI pitches, and basically everybody started building AI, obviously with that watershed moment of ChatGPT being released. And we simply saw a lot of like very thin now like become a thing, or even as a ChatGPT wrappers, basically. And I think there's nothing bad with a ChatGPT wrapper, because in theory, everybody can build anything, but like the devil is obviously in the details. So if you execute really well, which is key to most, it really works. But basically people are building features and not products. That is our observation. So you have this like whatever optimization for ads or something. So yeah, most likely Shopify will build that into their stuff, or Meta will build that in whatever you do. Or we've seen a lot of like observation startups of how well I am doing on ChatGPT. Well, I mean, there's people like SEMrush and whatever. So it's just another feature to build that in. So we think, and now they're talking about the SaaS apocalypse, basically. And we think you really got to deliver a lot of like value and really get into like the value chain at a very core point in the company to create a product which is really lasting and will not just be replaced by ChatGPT.
I mean, I think you're spot on. I wrote about this recently in relation to the tech sell-off that you just hinted at with like the, all SaaS products are doomed, right? With the kind of three states where it's like, if you're a company that does one thing, it's over, right? You may as well pack up your bags because AI can do that one thing. If you're a platform, and you're sold into the enterprise, maybe you can hang on for a couple of years because enterprises are slow to rip things out, right? Or maybe you're doing something really well with AI, in which case you can just hang on for a little bit as long as OpenAI and Claude allow you to exist, which I think is a really ridiculous thing. But, look, markets overreact. That's what happens. People overreact to things. But what I'm really curious about, and I know we want to get into this on this episode, is here you are, you're building a platform. I mean, anybody who looks at a CRM, typically they think platform, right? You think Salesforce, you think HubSpot, you think these systems that inevitably branch out into different places in your marketing and your sales processes. So here you are building this. You have a stated goal, I would assume, to not be just a feature and to not be a thin wrapper around an existing AI API. So how do you do it?
I think, first of all, it's important to understand the state of the whole CRM industry we're in. I mean, basically every company needs a CRM. So at least if you sell something, which most companies do. But the problem is they all suck. So nobody wants to actually use them. Show me that one person who says, oh my God, I can log on in my CRM in the morning and it's delightful joy. No, it's not. It's terrible. You get like bombarded with form fields and have to fill out stuff. Basically, I tried to set up one of those when we started Expedite Ventures just to manage our deal flow. And I said, no, that's it. I'll just use Excel. That's better. Google, yeah. So everybody is frustrated by CRMs. That's generally a good point to start a company with, because usually you're not the only one. And I think we are interestingly at the tipping point for general AI applications, because many people have been focused on B2C apps when it comes to AI. And B2B has largely been untouched. And the existing companies, like you named Salesforce and HubSpot, by the way, they both lost 60-70% of their value on the stock market in the last year. So if you short it, you're a happy person. Otherwise, you might be not. And obviously, they see what's coming, and the only answer they have is to bolt on a chatbot. That's basically, for me, the equivalent to Clippy in Word, if you remember that one. That's what everybody does. And if they're like very fancy, like HubSpot, they build an MCP server. But I think that's not the answer to it. Especially in the CRM case, there are two main aspects. First, I think just putting everything in form fields doesn't cut it. For example, we treat conversations as a basis of our data structure. As we are having a conversation now, you're having Google Meets, you're exchanging emails, you're exchanging WhatsApps or iMessages or whatever. And that contains a lot of data. You might not even know that you might need it later. And fortunately with AI, we are now at a point where with embeddings and semantic databases and all that kind of stuff, and vector databases, computers can actually understand the meaning of what you're saying. You don't have to fill out form fields anymore. For example, one thing we built in is we don't have any required fields in the CRM. We just have fields we don't know yet about. That's basically one philosophy. So that's important because that's a totally different data model. Whether you say, okay, I want to have a zip code, I want to have a name, and I want to have an opportunity stage in percent. Rather you say, I'll try to see your Google meetings, your Google emails, your Meet transcripts and say, hey, I see you're in New York next week and you have 2 hours. Maybe you want to meet Peter because you have done business with him a year ago, but you didn't for the last year and you made $1 million with him. So maybe you want to have a coffee with him. Here's an idea for an email. So that basically demonstrates, I think, that you have to rethink on the one hand way on what kind of data you're building up. Also, that influences a lot the decisions, what kind of data stores you're using, by the way, also in Rails. And on the second thing, I think we also need to rethink UIs. Basically, we are building in the product in a way that we don't expect that people will use our UI. Of course, we have a UI and we need a UI at this point, but we think maybe in 3 years or 2 years, we will live maybe in ChatGPT or in Messenger or whatever. And I think this whole, you can use a B2B app solely by text, chat, voice will be, in my opinion, a very defining pattern how people use B2B software. And you need to be prepared for that.
What do you say to that, Valentino?
You make a lot of great points. And I wonder, where do you decide as you're diving into all this, what the most valuable touch point is? You know, a lot of people start to question, should they be building anything for an AI application when it could be, you know, one of these model companies could just decide they're going to offer it. Well, how do you not just decide, oh, I'm going to build for ChatGPT integration or something along these lines versus what is the value? You know, how do you weigh that value of product building at this point? Because I feel like a lot of people, they get in that feature building mentality and they're like, well, yeah, I'll just build the features until the model company gives it to me. And then I'll just stop building that feature and then have it for free and still pay the model company. Where do you see that product value and product building really translate for you?
First of all, the very old saying is still true that people massively overestimate the short-term impacts of technology and massively underestimate the long-term impacts. So there will be huge of impacts for every one of us, especially in the software industry in the next 10 years. And the next year, maybe not so much, because specialized applications are like really hard to build. I mean, we barely have self-driving cars. So if AI is so great, why doesn't it just build overnight Tesla self-driving car software? No, it can't. It's hard. It's really hard to do. And obviously, for example, when we started, we talked, which is generally a great recommendation, which I would do to anybody who's starting a company, talk to a lot of people without writing a single line of code. We interviewed 300, 400 people. How do you use your CRM? Or do you use the CRM at all? So you learn a lot at that point, and half of them don't need a CRM at all. They're just fine with Excel because it's just a very small company and maybe they save a lot of money.
And also because Excel is actually great software. It's been 40 years. It's great. Everybody wants to dump on it. It's great software.
Software competes with Excel. Your main competitor on the slide should be always Excel.
Yeah.
But that's it. And from the other, you learn a lot. And the main question was, hey, why don't you just build a better front end for HubSpot and Salesforce? And that's the short-term reaction. And we could have obviously done that because, for example, you can talk with our system and all that stuff. And we could have put that into via MCP to HubSpot or whatever. But that doesn't cut it because, first of all, you're not really building a platform and you're not owning the data. And therefore, you have a very limited understanding of the data. And what I just said, that the conversation is the basis for everything for us, that simply is not possible with the data model of all legacy CRM vendors. And I think we are going to like some phase. Obviously, we have the old ones like Microsoft and HubSpot and Salesforce, and they're all fine for enterprise. By the way, for example, we are not targeting enterprise. We think there is so much stuff you have to consider, integrating ERP system, whatever. I think Salesforce is great at it, and they just have that market. That's fine. But there's a huge market around that. There were a lot of like other competitors who came up, especially around the data augmentation thing, like Attio, Clay, Augment, vFlow, and how they're all called. And I think they solved one thing with agentic stuff, that they basically find out more information about the people you're talking to. Mainly, that's what most of these systems are about. But nobody really changed that radical thinking about CRMs. Like, what if you only have a chat prompt to interact with your system? Hey, show me the sales reports of last month. Oh, now it's divided by state and now down to the city level, or by a sales rep and now by product and whatever. And it just gives you the graphics without clicking through interface. And I think this is where we maybe will end up in, because yes, look at Claude Cowork. That's what people expect now.
Yeah, you make a lot of great points there. The question of do we build a product has always existed. And I think 37 Signals is notorious for like proving everybody wrong, that you can just like make something well built and have minimal features added to it, and it just works great for your customers that you're trying to serve. Right?
So the question was always, why doesn't Google build it, for example?
Right, exactly. So you've decided you're going to build this company and you reach for Rails. Why? I'm curious.
First of all, I really love Rails. I got into Rails in 2007. And funnily, I heard that long 6 hours interview with DHH, and I can relate to a lot of points, because before Rails, I thought I was a really shitty programmer because I really hated to get into details about pointers and C and whatever. So mentally, I understood it, but it didn't like to do it, to be honest. And Rails really, even though that's a very old phrase, it really gave me joy in programming. Everything came together and it worked. If you're doing a web application, obviously. I mean, it might be different if you're doing self-driving cars. And therefore, we were based on Objective-C at that point in the company, and we made a big plan to rewrite our whole, it was content management system and customer experience suite, rewrote it all to Rails, and that was very successful. And we were really happy with it and built software which is used by millions and hundreds of millions of users back in the days. And then AWS came along, and also there I learned a lot. And for example, I was always a fan of non-relational databases for many applications, because many applications are not actually relational. Even a CRM is not relational. You have very simple relations in a CRM. You have people who work at companies and opportunities who might belong to companies and might belong to people, but that's it. And especially in the AI phase, where you basically get back structured output, this is literally JSON, it's really interesting in putting that in a database and then re-indexing it also, for example, in OpenSearch or Elasticsearch at the same time, and then basically just understanding it and slicing and dicing with the data, which is really, really hard when you have a relational system, which is not really built for that kind of structured, unstructured data, I think. But back to your point, I love Ruby, I love Rails. I built a successful company and out of it sold it, and there was no even a question. And interesting, every time I look, I don't want to start a rant here, but every time I look into like TypeScript and React and Python, I always think, how does people get away with sometimes building all these packages which you have to install and then it doesn't work? And Ruby just works. It is a very beautiful language and a beautiful ecosystem, and with very friendly people. I've just seen it. I was at Rails World in Amsterdam, and nothing changed over the last 15 years.
You are ranting, which is good. We are pro rant on the Ruby AI podcast, so thank you for that.
I don't understand it. Basically, when we started, we said we don't do any JS. We couldn't really hold that through. So I really was saying, no, we don't want Yarn. We don't want NPM or whatever in our system. We have to now for certain stuff with like Tailwind, but we still have that philosophy of never using JavaScript unless it's like absolutely necessary with Stimulus and whatever. And I think it's tremendous what that whole Stimulus Hotwire ecosystem has produced. It is so amazing how you can work with that stuff. And it's just great. It's awesome.
I'm curious. I would like to drill in on the sort of the architecture. So you've spoken about DynamoDB. So you're a proponent of NoSQL. You're a proponent of non-relational databases. And you wrote a little bit about the product you just shipped, the open source library you just shipped, which is the AWS SDK, HTTP async. And I'm curious to know, so what problem were you seeing in production that made this necessary?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is what I like about DynamoDB is it's a non-relational database, which is suitable for the kind of data we have, is you don't have to deal with managing the database. And I think that's the point people, in my experience, running at least in a scaling B2B app, constantly underestimate. I've seen, but it all works with Postgres. Yeah, it does, obviously, but you really need to have somebody dancing around and it works until it doesn't. So then you forgot an index here or it doesn't scale here. You need to think about a lot of things. And the beauty about DynamoDB is if you design it right, you can throw literally petabytes of data on it and it will scale if you exactly know what you're doing. And that's what I like about it. What I had to look into is when we first used Ruby OpenAI gem and then moved to Ruby LLM because there was a new hot kit on the block and it still is. And one of the things it proposed was the use of async. And that's really interesting. And that is something I actually haven't touched a lot. I knew it existed, but it became very clear that you have to deal with async when you're building a modern Ruby application with AI, because it's not CPU intense. You're basically waiting for HTTP calls to LLMs all the time. And that's when I had to relearn a lot of stuff I learned in Ruby, actually. So I learned using threads is actually bad, or just using simple pipe equals operator, obviously, is very, very bad. That was already bad in threads, but I have to now to use fiber with key, or I used to have to use concurrent maps, or sleep doesn't work because it blocks reactor. I have to use async sleep.sleep. So I felt I had to relearn a lot of like idioms, which were like totally naturally for me for the last 10 years. And I must say, RubyLM brought that to me. And we are running, for example, Falcon in production as a web server, which is the web server of the async. And everybody says, it's so easy. And apparently Shopify uses it. But when you really use it in production, there's a lot of like very undocumented feature, to put it mildly, or bugs. And I totally admire the work that Socrates guy has done. But it's far from, I just install it and then it works. I recently just updated from like 0.28 to 0.29 and it totally crashed because of a different behavior. And to be honest, AWS support of Ruby is okay-ish, but not great, because I don't think they have a very big team. They're very responsive and they're very nice, but I don't think they put a ton of resource in it, which is a shame. So shout out to AWS, put more resources into Ruby and not that much into TypeScript, Go, and Python, I would say. And the main problem is that DynamoDB also is basically a service which you call via HTTP, so it's basically simply the same. And I saw there's a lot of like stuff which blocks each other or simply does not wait correctly. And it's really, really hard to debug because it's a library you don't own. So I basically try to make some kind of patch to support more modern libraries. And there's this async HTTP library, which works well, but it's really hard. So I think many Ruby developers have to relearn a lot of things when it comes to async, is my observation. I had to.
Yeah, I feel like it's not just async. I feel like we're all relearning how to build applications because we are leaning more and more on this kind of LLM high IO bound workflows. And you're right. Like, I feel like some web servers, we won't name names, but like some web servers just aren't built for heavy IO use. And that's acceptable. And that was where things were before, is we didn't have a lot of IO bound tasks other than your database. And if you can couple that to your user, then it can work well for very specific servers. And we're kind of like shifting to like this new way of serving customers where the user isn't bound to that request or the data, and many things are involved in accessing the data at the same time in a more async fashion. And so we're kind of like, doing this dance of like relearning what the best conventions and configurations are. And that's going to even change, right? Like maybe everybody's workflow isn't making the most use of like these LLM calls in the same ways. And it might not make sense to just use Falcon, right? Or using async for everything. And it is going to be like a long process of finding the best use cases for how much you're leaning into what. I guess my question for you is, at what stage did you decide, how are you mapping this out when you're building the thing? Did you decide going into it that you kind of knew that you were going to be so heavy with all of the LLM use and chaining, or you had to make use of async, or did you find that out after the fact? Where in your building process did these kind of shifts change?
I had to basically, because before we were using Ruby OpenAI gems, so that used threads and that somehow worked-ish, but it wasn't like very natural. But the thing is, for example, what we are doing is we are often not just firing one prompt, but we're firing a magnitude of prompts when we get in user input. For example, when you're talking to the system, there's something obviously we have to first interpret what you're actually saying. So we get basically a stream of data back. At the same time, we send that stream of data back to find out what are the entities in that stream. Joe is a person. Valentino is a person. Ruby is something else or whatever. 30 seconds is the company. So that gets sent back and forth. And when you're then ready with talking, we try to immediately show an executive summary. So what we understood is you met with ABC, you talked about blah, 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 blah. That means it's another back and forth with a different model because it needs to be a faster model, which is like better on summarizing stuff and so on and so on. Then we have another model which tries to get tasks out of it and try to understand, okay, I met with him, what's the next steps? We want to present him like suggestions, what to do. And that's when it became really clear that just even one conversation with the system fires a lot of like different prompts, different interaction with different model providers. It's not even just OpenAI, it's also Gemini and others, and there's text-to-speech and blah, 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 blah. So that's when we found out we need to look into that async stuff on a way, because if you take that from a multi-tenant perspective and see multiple people are doing that at the same time, you can't make them wait for so long.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think too, we're almost like Ruby kind of came from this like, Lisp small talk phase of language building, trying to be object oriented as a base. And do you see like that your programming of Ruby leans more into that style of programming? Like, has your use of Ruby changed based on how these things are evolving? Do you find yourself still making service classes? Are those like tricks still in play, or do you notice new kind of patterns are evolving?
What I definitely see is there is a lot less stuff going on in models and a lot of more stuff going on in services and concerns to these services and stuff. So that is definitely a total difference of what we did before. And for example, although when we composed the prompts, I was like very Ruby driven at the beginning. So I basically created a class LLM service user import, which inherits from LLM servers. And then I included LLM prompt with context, LLM prompt with actor, LLM prompt with entities, with performance indicators and whatever. And it simply wasn't manageable. So the classic inheritance stuff didn't work. But there was stuff which worked. So, for example, as you said, we did our own prompt components. Maybe we turned it into a gem and release it publicly, which is simply like view components. And you could learn a lot of like how view components were built in building prompt components, because it technically is the same. They can also inherit from each other, but not all at the same time. They get inputs, they get outputs. They have a part which does calculations. They have a part which just generates a markdown. So that's really interesting to do that. So that changed a lot. But this whole service orchestration and having an overview which model calls what at a certain point is really, really tricky because it's not just like the model. It's like you have agents, you have tool calls, which are basically classes in itself or subclasses, which might be or might not be different between different services. You have also what many people don't do at the beginning, a lot of telemetry and tracking. So for example, we are big chains of LangFuse. Shout out to them. Great product. Everybody should use it. It's not that easy to integrate in Ruby if you want to do it well, but that's not on LangFuse, that's on Ruby. Because you have like traces and spans and exactly what I described. You have one, let's say, one thing or one input, and that triggers a lot of like different prompts, and you want to see what happened at what point. And then comes the next model out, and you want to see, okay, what would have happened if I ran that with not 4.1, but 5.2? And this is when it really gets tricky. And this is like the whole, which is not totally Ruby related, but basically our whole LLM code do at least 10 things. And then comes chain invalidation. You change the system prompt. You can't continue conversations on the same system prompt. You want to design them that they're casual by OpenAI, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that is really hard. I don't think I have fully found the answer to it, but my application or our application vendors looks now very different than a Rails application I might have done like 5 years ago, I would say.
So how do you see that scaling? Do you have to like rethink your scaling methodology as well? Is it not just like vertical over horizontal scaling? Like, do you find yourself like maybe considering serverless more because that maybe aligns with your objects more? Does any of that kind of change in your building process, or is that pretty much like the same considerations?
No, I don't think the scaling is at least our problem because the way we build it. So DynamoDB scales like there's no tomorrow. OpenSearch hosted on AWS also scales like no tomorrow. So it will take a lot of like revenue until we get to limits on that point. Rails also scales. Falcon is like really fast with that async stuff if you once got it managed. And if you have these auto scaling, we got all our infrastructure totally automated. So it scales up and down and we have different environments and blah, blah, blah. Although we are using very classic patterns of queuing. So we're using SQS on AWS, but could be also Redis or whatever. So basically every time when we call a LLM, it fires a background job, which gets picked up by a class or a fleet of workers. And then the workers might update your turbo stuff in the front end, which is a kind of a really interesting thing, but it really works well, that pattern. So we really try to keep the web front end as lean as possible and try to do as much stuff in workers. And I think that pattern scales very well. And that's not nothing new in Ruby. So that's very pretty standard stuff with Sidekick or whatever people have been doing for decades. And so there's a lot of patterns which are very natural to Ruby or the ecosystem, which come very normal when you're building AI applications. I felt I didn't have to bend backwards just to get something done. It was always clear in what way you do it. I think it's just, you have to think, how do I do it that I keep it maintainable? That's the main point. And not just for me, but also for agents. You said you talked with a lot of people like about how they build it. And obviously we use also a lot of agentic coding. And that requires very strict discipline about documentation. So we have a huge folder, MD Docs, where we basically document every feature we're doing in detail. Maybe we should have done that 10 years ago in old applications as well. But that keeps it a bit more manageable. Even if I don't remember, how was that actually built? I can just ask Claude or Codex, hey, and it gives me an answer in like 30 seconds. So that's good.
Hey, I'm curious about that last part because you talked about sort of Claude Code rules and how there's a potential there to improve style of code, right? Which I think I like that viewpoint because there's so much focus on just churning out code and not even looking at it, let alone kind of observing style or design as it evolves. Now, you just mentioned that you use a lot of these rule files, right, in MD library. Are there other ways that you enforce style, for example, through repo conventions or through the tests themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was always a pain in the ass when it comes to formatting code. So I hate it when stuff looks different. So the first thing I did is to put a CI pipeline on, or using bin CI since it's one. And so we have one linter phase and it calls a lot of like different linters. We're using Herb Big shout out to Marco, great library. We used EIB-lint before. We're using Rails formatter, we're using Rufo, we are using RuboCop. So basically, every code gets checked 3 or 4 times, and it's built in all in our agent rules. You must not deliver any code before rate app formatter is actually run. And you can't even check it in both on GitHub as well as on the deployment if there's even the Rufo, RuboCop, whatever style rules don't match. So I think like that's super important. And it might sound a little bit anal, but it's really helping to have a very consistent code base. Also look at these like Ruby 3.4 with this it syntax, for example. I really like it. So I said, I want to have the syntax consistent in all the code base. And that's task which can be really done well. I think we put a lot of work in the orchestration between Claude and Codex. Because just for our use case, I don't know what's for everybody, Claude is really great at planning, but Codex is, in our experience, much better in implementing. It follows the rules of the actual implementation much, much better. But obviously the application itself is better in Claude. So what we did is we created a lot of like agent and skills to do that. And interestingly, it was a bit of an invest in the future because you had to nudge Claude that it actually uses it. And with every release, it uses it more. So it's better. Also with agent teams. And I even wrote shell scripts which said, okay, you touched the controller, and which reminds it, you have not run that skill. So you need to run that skill to check whether it complies to our whatever rules. And you really have to put in effort. You have to understand how these tools work. If you have a bad Claude and Agents MD and a bad setup with that, I think you're not getting very far if you have a huge app to maintain. So that's where I'm putting a lot of effort, and we have a lot of like standardized slash commands. So I can, for example, say when this plan in Claude, and that calls, it does this plan, and then mandatory calls Codex. You can run Codex as an MCP. I even wrote a small NPM package called MCP agents, where you can call Gemini, and it says, if you disagree, don't even ask Gemini about a third opinion. And what you get back then, when they all figured it out with each other, is like really gold, especially as Rails is so structured in terms of what goes where. And that really works out extraordinarily well for us.
Yeah, what do they call it? The conferring of judges or something like that? Where you
kind of that.
Group think. Yeah.
Totally. There was a big Shopify talk on the last Rails Word about that. I think they put it to a totally different level. We are not like that elaborated. But for instance, LangFuse also has features to do that, LLM-as-a-judge. And I think that gets more and more important. And it's not just about the coding side, but also when we get back an output, like an important output when it comes to like money or whatever, you might want to double check that with a different model.
Yeah.
I do that too. I do that with text. I do that with like strategy and stuff like that, because something comes back and it's like, okay, well, I think this is smart, but it's going to outsmart me because it's a word calculator. It knows how to put these great words in place. So I take it, whatever it might be. And I'm like, all right, well, let's see what Gemini has to say about this. Let's see what Claude, has to say about this. Let's see what OpenAI has to say about it. Yeah, it really does work.
Codex finds in 90% of the cases, it finds something where Claude says, oh, great findings by Codex. I haven't thought about that. Let me put that in. And that is...
It's funny that you get that, because a lot of times I get, that LLM is wrong and here's why, which I love. Like, oh, you're just throwing shade at Claude or whatever. It's so funny.
I wonder if there's like a competition MD file that's secretly stored somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't do too great at these points.
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe. But especially when it comes, for example, I could have never found all the problems or stuff we did wrong with fibers if I wouldn't have like a rule or an agent in that, which checks it. And on Fiverr, you have, at least I'm not smart enough to do that. I have no chance to find all these edge cases where, oh, you need to put that in a fiber because that could have a concurrency with A, B, C. No chance. And it really is so much better in terms of code quality.
Yeah. So I'm curious. It seems like you're investing a lot in the coding agent help, which is a common pattern that's evolving as well. And so do you see yourself having to manage that a lot? Or is it once you get the good mechanisms in place, it kind of just starts going on autopilot a little more? How has that workflow been as far as like onboarding new members and getting other people to use the tooling? Is it pretty smooth sailing, or do you find yourself like circling back and you're just working on?
I think it's a bit of 80-20. You always have to force yourself not to over-engineer that stuff because there's always some new feature which you could, I didn't try that. And if the agent calls now the skill and blah, blah, blah. Well, you can overdo it for sure. And we did also try it with stuff that we have a Ralph loop, which basically constantly loops over the whole code, gives it to all the things, finds out, produces a big file. And when it's done, it starts from the beginning. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. So I think you can totally overdo it. I think it's important for an onboarding of new people to have some kind of standards in that. It's really hard. So we always say we plan with our vendors -plan or Rails -plan /command, which calls codecs, because it simply makes the output better. So that's important. And so I think, for example, we're a really small team. We are like my co-founder and I and our first employee. And we found it really hard to find employees. I was also at Rails World looking around, hey, maybe there's some person I can work with. And I found there's either junior people who are like totally hyped about AI, but really lack a bit of like, maybe it's that gut feeling, so no, that architecture feels wrong because you don't have the experience. And so many senior people I talked to said, oh no, I don't know. It's not as great as if I chisel the code myself. And so there's a big disconnect. And I felt like I'm in my late 40s. So I thought I'm sometimes like not the most flexible person, but met a lot of people where I thought, okay, this is like when I met a COBOL programmer, like in the early days when we were talking about Rails. And I think there will be people, either you adapt to that because it's so good and it's going to get better every day. Every second week comes out an innovation, which kind of blows my mind. But I tried that agent team features of Cloud Code and it started 5 Tmux windows and did different evaluations and came back and said, this is your problem. Okay, wow, good luck. So I think there has to be a certain recalibration of mindset in the programmers community. And I mean, apparently even DHH recalibrates. So that means a lot. I don't know. What's your opinion on that?
I'm torn because I lean heavy into all of it. I've also lived long enough to have seen the alternative. And so there are benefits to both sides. And like sometimes waiting can be more fruitful in some things. I'm having a hard time finding that balance myself.
Nobody on this podcast is young or mentally or physically flexible. However, we all lean into this because to me, it makes me feel like when I was a younger, less experienced engineer with a ton more to learn. And now, yeah, I know that there's always a ton to learn and I'm no expert at nearly anything, but I have thought highly of myself as a software engineer in the Ruby world. And now I look at it and say, wow, there is so much to learn. I think, Thomas, that your example of both learning that you had a lot to learn with respect to fibers and asynchronous Ruby and using AI to some capacity boost your learning and to another capacity boost the output is a perfect example of what I would shoot for as an IC, as a contributor to a project. There's the threshold where it's like, oh, I don't know as much as I thought I did. And hey, here's a bunch of tools that help me to not only learn it, but also use them to continue to be productive. I really don't see a downside. Show's over. That's it.
Mic drop.
So go generate some.
That was so smart.
Let's dig into because you did mention, maybe adopting some new technology like Falcon.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't exactly straightforward, even based on your past experience, right? It still isn't. I'm curious first, like, what are those areas that are pain points working with it, like figuring it, maybe getting used to the new style of working with a web server? What aspects of these facets of your traditional Rails development over the past, I imagine, decade or more, probably more, what facets are the bottlenecks for you? What are challenges? Where could somebody maybe more junior be more beneficial because they don't have that backlog of experience, maybe causing some friction?
So obviously we talked about fibers and async, and that's clearly the biggest thing. And not just from a technology perspective, when do you write which code, but also what actually happens. For example, there is a lot of like places in the code where the same data gets written to the same objects. For example, the executive summary might come in first, or the expected entities might come in first. But you all want to have it in the same object. So stuff like if you were in a relational database where a transaction, but even a transaction might be blocked. So what do you do if the data has been updated? Are we talking about the same data or not? For example, we're also never deleting data. We're having versioned data, and we can come back. And we have another LM which basically tells in natural language what has been the difference between those versions, what actually changed. So that kind of stuff. I think you have to very much get used to that. At the same point, data can be written from multiple places. At least that's for us a different point. And before you could say, okay, I collect all the data, I just do one transaction and then it's written. And that's, I think, not the case anymore. So data can come in at any time from any agent, from any long-running job, from any deep research or whatever. And you sometimes have to deal with stale data, sometimes even stale prompts. And what you also, in that terminology, had to rethink is we are building, obviously, a multi-tenancy app. So that takes it to some kind of a 3D chess level because everybody else has different prompts. Somebody who sells drinks as a customer has totally different prompts customized to that person than somebody who sells SaaS software. And also like totally different data structures because that first person maybe, or let's say you have a service versus a product, you have a day rate and you have a product budget and whatever, whereas you have churn and with SaaS and monthly plan and all that kind of stuff. So the data is vastly different from client to client and all of the prompts are. And keeping track of that and that multiplied by which model are they using is really tricky. And there's also not a lot Rails does for you in the terms of multi-tenancy stuff. There's a lot of things, and then making that observable with length views or whatever and tracking everything, because we are tracking everything because we're saying the conversation is the basis of our data. So if we get an email, we have to pull it back maybe 2 years later and reanalyze it for a certain angle which the client wants to know about. So where do you save it? How do you embed it and whatever? And that, especially in a multi-tenant context, is complicated, I would say.
Would you say you're on board with DHH's new proposal for like getting every customer their own kind of server in their closet?
Yeah, that's a new idea. When I started my company in like 1999, I was sitting with CDs and data centers installing software. So if we're going back to that, I don't want that back, to be honest. That was terrible. No, I don't think so. But I think this multi-tenancy is a thing. And I think also the orchestration stuff. For example, we think about a lot of like embeddings and how to logically understand data. And for example, OpenSearch and Elasticsearch made a lot of advancements in order to combine classic search with the actual understandings of something in terms of embeddings, vector search. And I think that is something which is barely touched, or I wouldn't say understood, but explored by the Rails community so far, and will become much, much, much more important because it won't be just about the relational data. And that's basically also my big rant I have about, like, let's say, the direction of Rails in general. It's very focused on active record. And as we are not attacking active record, you wouldn't imagine how many libraries we find which somehow more or less require active record. And there's already an alternative. There's active model. It's very easy to turn active model into kind of any database packet, but no, they have to have these foreign keys. They have to have these transactions or whatever. And I think that would be something, even with all this new solid queue stuff and solid emailing stuff and what they all build, that is all tied to active record. And I think we have to get used to that. I mean, not everybody has to run DynamoDB, but having a vector database or OpenSearch or something on the side of it will become very normal if we deal with all that embedding, because literally what our system does is translating structured output to unstructured output back and forth all the time. And simply active record is not built for that. You end up with an SQL form field disaster like we talked about HubSpot in the beginning.
So I'm curious about that because you've mentioned DynamoDB a couple of times. And so the last time I used a non-relational database in a Rails app was not that long ago, but I remember there being a lot of overhead and sort of some unexpected overhead with instrumentation, right? Like orchestrating applications to talk to each other, similar to what you're describing. So do you find that is a significant sort of headwind in development against a NoSQL database?
It is. Totally. It is totally. I mean, it's first of all, when people come and try to learn our code base, it's really hard because the usual patterns do not apply. And you see that with LLMs, you really have to teach them no active record in every Claude MD. And then
Right. That assumption, just like with humans, is going to be there. Right.
Exactly. And everybody behaves the same. So that's really hard. And I would say that the kind of a blocker, or not a blocker, but something which is like not so straightforward in our development. And it's not just us with DynamoDB. If you use MongoDB or whatever, you will run into similar problems. So it's not just this like, oh, I don't like AWS anyway world. And again, in the end, OpenSearch or Elasticsearch is also nothing else like a large DynamoDB or a large MongoDB in a way. So yeah, there is significant headwind because a lot of things you take for granted, from very simple helpers to, let's say, single table inheritance. You simply can't have a class which has another class, and then you query the base class and you get all the results of it. That simply does not work because it does not know how to do it. So I looked into a lot of like active record code, or investigated together with Claude Code to understand what did Rails do. And often it's very smart decisions, but unfortunately they're very tied into that relational database thing.
Yeah, it's the double-edged sword, right? Conventions are made to make it easier for LLMs. But if you want to do your own thing, that maybe it's just a little bit outside of the conventions. I was just going to say, yeah, you're focusing on those like customizations.
But in general, I mean, for example, when I started with my career, like back in the middle 90s, something which was very popular was functions in databases, PLSQL, if you remember that. That was the most horrible thing you could do because you write something in a database and totally unexpected. So the worst thing. And still, that's what I don't like about relational databases. They work great until they don't, because there is an index missing, or there's something, or this transaction blocks the another, or whatever. You have no idea with inner join, outer left join, blah, blah, blah. You really have to be an expert sometimes. And I think a lot of stuff which is put into the database could be also very well solved in a model or in a service in Rails, like especially when it comes to like verifications and stuff. And so if you go down to very primitive types, DynamoDB only has basically lists and strings and numbers. That's it. That makes your life easier and also makes your code easier. So there is advantages of doing it that way. And I hope that the Rails community at least acknowledges that there is something like active model and stuff can be solved differently. And I think, again, with that AI stuff, I think it will, because basically you're only dealing with JSON all the time. And good luck mapping that JSON to a relational database scheme all the time. It's not working.
You know, there's a popular alternative to active record for relational databases called SQL that maybe even predates active record in some ways. And it works great. And you know, you try and use that kind of in your own application and try and make agentic use out of it. And it's going to struggle a little bit in comparison. And so I kind of wonder, do you have any ideas here on how we can like better integrate with these agentic coding use cases for these maybe like one-off conventions that are conventions? They are popular. Sometimes the use case does apply, right? And so how do we maybe make things better so that it can work for these conventions and set up maybe some kind of convention or integration or tooling or something that we can establish the patterns and make it easier?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I thought about it a lot, or thinking daily about it when we were building Vendors AI. So I think we have to rethink the way we deal with services, because regardless of the relational versus non-relational debate, most of stuff is an HTTP endpoint these days. So the emails we're getting is in S3, obviously, but then you have own endpoints at OpenAI, where, for example, when you load out a batch, you have to fetch that batch. So it's another endpoint. And then you have your database. And then you have your telemetry services, which tracks all that. And you have 5 different model providers you're talking with. And then you have an open. So clearly that pattern, I mean, you can all include it and it works well with these like service.call, blah, blah, blah in services. So it's not bad. It's good. But structuring it and keeping track, I think there must be more to it. So I think we need to have some joint brainstorming in the Rails community to think how to make services better and maybe tie services more to HTTP endpoints, and you do a lot of like glue code with like retry stuff, and every library is different and you couldn't reach it. So capacity limit reach. So you do a retry on that stuff, and Google handles differently than OpenAI and blah, blah, blah. So that's not great. And I think there is more to it. I have no idea how to do it or what would be better. But I think that needs to be a direction where Rails should be thinking about.
Yeah, I don't have a solution, so.
No, me neither. I'm not smart enough for that. But maybe somebody
The overall goal of this podcast is to just find people that maybe have the answers for me. You actually do have a lot of answers out there, related to Falcon and async and all of your new adjustments. So it's exciting to hear where the world is going, because everything is shifting every day. So
yeah, I agree. I like the sort of, I'm going to use the overloaded term agile, but your agile approach, by which I mean agility, I don't mean a framework, right, to the constraints that you're facing and the opportunities that are there in equal measure.
Totally. I mean, we couldn't build Vendor's AI with traditional ways because there's so much stuff to orchestrate, and it is like this typical 10x. I definitely feel it. I don't know whether it's 10x or 8x or maybe 6x, but with like a 3-person team, you can get really, really far. And I think that's when like Sam Altman was this quote, oh, the next person will be a $1 billion company. Maybe not a 1-person company, but I mean, hey, come on, WhatsApp built like a multi-billion dollar business with like, I think 30 people, 40 people. So what I definitely think the time of like huge teams is over. And you can't tell me that sometimes people have like 200 developers. What do they do all day? I don't know. I mean,
in fairness, I never really knew.
No. It was totally. I mean, there are e-commerce sites which employ 600 developers. What do they do? It's mind blowing. So I think like really having small teams which all understand the code base, which can commit, which can deploy like anytime, and which have all these modern tools at your disposal. I mean, for like $400, you get both OpenAI Max and Claude Max subscription, and gets you very, very far. So I think it will be the age of smaller companies doing a lot of great software where you would have needed to be Salesforce.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely feel the ex-developer, whatever number that is. For me, at first, it was definitely, well, now I get to complete all my side projects and on ideas that I have. Right?
Exactly. That's a good thing in summer.
At some point, that transition will fall off a cliff and you'll run out of things that you want to side project. And I wonder what that world looks like when people are kind of exhausted by the maybe speed at which they can experiment with them, and maybe what draws their attention then, right?
Oh no, I think there's so much stuff left to be built. I mean, I don't know how it is in the US, but just take a look at e-government. There's so many processes which could be digital where you think I have to fill a form out for that. If just that would get better, our lives would all become exponentially better. So there is a lot of stuff which is not digitized yet. And I think even maybe software where we need a lot of consulting and whatever. So I think the role of all these consulting agencies will change as well. But I strongly believe there will be the need for software like CRM and Basecamp, what Citizen does. I don't think that like OpenAI comes around and now you manage all your products in OpenAI and nobody uses Basecamp anymore. It's really hard to imagine. And sometimes it's so specialized and there's so much domain knowledge in it. And sometimes you see how great it is, but sometimes you think you didn't catch that. You don't understand that. I'm telling you now for the 3rd time and you're still implementing it wrong because apparently you didn't get the problem. So make no mistakes. This is obviously in 2 years, we will laugh about many of these problems, but good product management and what everybody says, like having good product management, doing good documentation, all these like very basic skills which were valid 25 years ago, they are now more relevant than ever. And if you master them, just start developing something in like some language because it's so cool and everybody uses React, so do we. I think it can get you very far.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we are seeing the revitalization of the Excel era, and everybody was once able to, solve all their problems in Excel, and then they hit limitations, and now they get a little bit step further, where they could solve all their problems with ChatGPT or something, except for the nice packaging that comes with using a product that somebody has focused a very specific use case for.
I already know what's going to happen to you, Valentino. I already know the future. First, you'll never run out of side projects. And what's going to happen is that what you deem a side project today is going to be laughable 3 years from now, because you're going to say, oh, my side project is basically rebuilding Salesforce. Your little kind of experiment will grow in size and complexity. That's your future.
It's funny you mentioned that. I finally installed OpenClaw. Honestly, I'm not here on that.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Great. I pay for domains. I have so many domains. I've had them so long. And I'm like, finally just like, all right, here's a list of all the domains I have. What's valuable? What could you make a product out of? And then, oh, yeah, go build those products, right? Oh, well, listen, I have 3 pull requests I have to review that are supposedly done.
Yeah.
All I got to do is enter my Stripe credentials.
Yeah.
This $3 billion companies already is down.
Already.
Just need to release the... Maybe one thing I would, because when I thought about it, and I already said it before, I think what's massive is in which quick time these platforms, let's just talk ChatGPT, could amass such a sheer amount of users. I don't think even the iPhone, I mean, when I had my first iPhone, obviously I had it on the first day and I was totally excited about it. Many people came out, no, but I have my Nokia communicator or whatever. So the adoption curve was not that high because, oh, it was so expensive. What was it, $600? Now people pay $2,000 for a phone. So that changed. But don't make no mistake, they have a huge user base, and I'm sure they will try to become a platform themselves where people log in, just like Google was for a long time. And I see it with everyone around me, not technical people who ask every single question to ChatGPT. And I think we should prepare for a world in terms of UIs where we will live in other applications. I mean, we had that a little bit with the iPhone where we had apps which also lived in something else. And you see what kind of great market of billion-dollar companies emerged simply out of that. And I think once they really start to monetize that as a base and make interface, and they already start doing it with these SDK where you can have like little mini apps for, I think, Booking.com or something. But I think this will inevitably come, and maybe the others will also jump on the bandwagon. Meta will say everything now less than WhatsApp, and whatever you type will also be routed to 15 different companies, whatever, I don't know. But I think that's the thing we should prepare for, to go away from UIs and prepare for voice and chat as a main means of communication with apps. I think that will be the biggest change in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I'm game. We'll have to have you on next year when you're $1 billion company, and we'll have to learn how you scale.
We will publicly sympathize with you for having to share the $1 billion with 2 other people. That'll be the sad part.
Exactly.
Thomas, it was really great having you on the show.
It was great having you.
It's a lot of fun talking with you. And we'd love to talk with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward. And everybody who's looking for a CRM, reach out to me. Happy to onboard. We are in private beta, but I'm happy to onboard customers. Yes, vendis.ai, or write me an email at thomas@vendis.ai, and I'm happy to walk you through.
If people wanted to find you on social, are you on?
I'm on X, on GitHub, on LinkedIn, Thomas Witt, basically either it's Thomas Witt or Thomas_Witt. So it's kind of easy to find me.
Yeah, and he's active in the Ruby AI Builder Discord. So
yeah, that's what I would really recommend to everybody, to join that Discord, the Ruby AI Builders, because there are many people there with although sometimes very controversial opinions, but you can learn a lot.
Yeah, there's lots of great stuff in there. I always like seeing the controversial chatter. Sometimes I'll find I'm on one side and then quickly on the other by the end of the day.
Well, that's a good thing. If you're in New York right now, come and see Valentino, our very own, give a talk at Artificial Ruby tonight.
I made a Ruby gem called Chaos to the Rescue, where it uses method missing to patch itself in real time.
I love it.
It's a lot of fun. It's mostly fun. We'll see. I mean, maybe it will be a serious thing someday.
Method missing claw.
Yeah, method missing claw, exactly. The ultimate loop. I finally got it the other day. When I'm in an IRB session, if I type quit, it actually exits the program.
Oh, nice.
Instead of saying, I don't know what quit is.
Yeah, that was right. Def quit.
All right. Well, Thanks again, Thomas. And until next time, folks, happy hacking.
See you, everybody.
Bye.